Of course. So last time I believe we spoke on this program, I think we were expressing skepticism about the Biden administration's announcement at the start of his presidency that he would be ending, quote, U.S. support for offensive operations in Yemen. And that language was very specific on purpose. The definition of offensive operations can be narrowly tailored, and the defensive operations definition, at least from the Saudis' perspective, can be quite broad. So where are we now since we spoke about that last?
Definitely. So, as you pointed out, that sort of offense defense distinction is doing a lot of work for the administration. And that is something that, international relations scholars still debate of how exactly can you distinguish offensive from defensive. The good news is that a de facto truce does remain in place in Yemen. So almost a year ago, the Saudis and the Houthis agreed to stop firing transborder projectiles and airstrikes. The Saudis also agreed to allow some fuel to get into Yemen's Hodeidah port. Up to that point, there had been an acute fuel crisis that had caused things like there was no fuel for hospitals to run generators to keep ventilators on, for example. So that's good news. There's been fuel getting in. Some flights have been allowed from Sana'a International Airport, and this has continued despite the fact that the UN-sponsored truce did officially expire in October. So it has been quite interesting. Even though the truce is no longer officially in effect, the two sides have been holding to it. So this is all positive news from the perspective of Yemenis who have not had to deal with Saudi airstrikes. However, if the Saudis decide to start dropping bombs again, there's nothing stopping them, and they would continue to do so with U.S. support.
So that's the context behind these comments from Blinken that we'll play now. This was we have that, Bradley, the Yemen. These comments from Blinken, he's imploring here the United Nations to act on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I just wanted to get your response to this. This was from a few days ago. To me, it seems like, well, this is on you, dude. But we can react to this in a bit. Here he is asking for more UN help in Yemen.
Secretary General Guterres, Undersecretary Griffiths, Minister Forcell, Minister Cassis, thank you for bringing us together and for never losing sight of the millions of Yemeni women, children, and men experiencing one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. At a time when many serious challenges call for our time and attention, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen remains an issue where our collective action has made and can continue to make a tremendous difference. Our funding, together with the relative calm created by the UN brokered truce, prevented 2.2 million Yemenis from falling into emergency levels of food insecurity, where people's lives depend on urgent action. And it prevented tens of thousands of others from slipping into famine-level conditions. In total, aid agencies helped reach 11 million people every month in 2022, about a third of all Yemenis. That's millions of people with clean water to drink, a meal in their stomachs, roofs over their heads, access to basic health care, including reproductive care, in a country where pregnancy can be a death sentence, with a mother dying every 2 hours from complications from pregnancy and childbirth. And yet, in the coming year, 2/3 of Yemen's population, 21.6 million people, will need humanitarian assistance and protection. Over 2 million of them are children suffering from acute malnutrition. Their lives depend in no small part on what we do. We've seen what happens when aid is inadequate. Last year, funding gaps forced the UN to scale back or cut over half its life-saving programs. In December, these shortfalls meant assistance programs could only meet 40% of the caloric needs of people requiring food assistance. To a child in need, there's nothing abstract about a reduction like that. It's simply more intense hunger or life-threatening malnutrition. At the same time, Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine continues to make Yemen's food crisis worse. Before the war, Yemen imported half its food supply from Russia and Ukraine, and President Putin's invasion has made that supply both more expensive and less reliable.
Yeah, let's just, you kind of get the gist there. I would say that, yes, Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine has increased food instability internationally, and energy instability in Europe, all of these kinds of things. But that is quite a leap, in my opinion, to blame the crisis in Yemen on the war in Ukraine, which preceded that. It began under the Obama administration. Our blockade directly contributed to the conditions that Blinken is describing there. And how about the United States just end all support financially for the Saudis here? Then he wouldn't, in one hand, have to exacerbate the conditions in Yemen, and on the other, call on the United Nations to help alleviate the conditions that we are helping exacerbate. It really is kind of inexcusable to be making this case publicly when everybody knows what the Biden administration is doing on the ground in terms of funding.
Right. Well, and another thing, while it's certainly admirable that Secretary Blinken is calling for more funding, which is absolutely necessary, especially from wealthy Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which again are directly responsible for this crisis in Yemen, he doesn't mention the fact that the US is actually going to be cutting funding to Yemen by 25% this year, with apparently additional cuts up to 40% in the coming years. So it's, as you say, it's not only horrifying given that the United States is directly responsible for what is happening in Yemen, but also we're looking to significantly reduce the amount of funding that we're providing. And as he pointed out, funding is already woefully insufficient for Yemen. This notion that a 40% cut in what, that someone's getting aid, but it's not enough, so someone receives food aid and yet they're still hungry because it's not enough to keep someone alive, is just truly horrifying. There was a CNN opinion piece that just came out from the director of an organization, I believe, called War Child USA, who was able to go to these parts of northern Yemen, most of which are controlled by the Houthi rebels, where the majority of Yemenis live and where food insecurity is especially acute. And his description of just, this is a whole generation of people who are lucky to be alive, but their growth is stunted. He thought he was in a classroom of kindergartners and it was 9-year-olds. This is just a whole generation of Yemenis, who are lucky to be alive and whose entire lives have been completely derailed by this horrific war. I totally agree with you that this notion that Blinken should portray what the United States is doing as admirable and worthy of applause is is pretty horrifying.
Well, they want to have it both ways. They want to appear like they care about the humanitarian conditions in Yemen, while at the same time not antagonize the Saudis, which is really all this seems to come down to. Take us to December, a few months ago, when Bernie Sanders introduced a war powers resolution to end U.S. support for actions in Yemen. The Biden administration, by all accounts, whipped votes. I believe that Ryan Grimm of The Intercept reported on this to kill Bernie's attempt to curb the United States' help for the Saudis. How did that go down?
Exactly. So Bernie, had committed to bringing the war powers resolution to the floor. This had previously passed under Trump. The war powers resolution passed both houses of Congress, and Trump then vetoed it. And so it did not come into effect. But it was the first time that the War Powers Act had actually been applied since it was passed in the context of the Vietnam War in 1973. So when Bernie committed to reintroducing it, at the very last minute, he actually didn't bring it to the floor because he was facing such stiff opposition from the administration. He said that he would be working with the Biden administration on ending U.S. involvement, and that he would reintroduce the War Powers Resolution if he didn't get adequate indications from the Biden administration that they were ending U.S. involvement here. But as you said, this really is about the U.S. relationship with the Saudis. Saudi Arabia remains America's biggest customer of our arms industry. And U.S. weapons manufacturers are not interested in jeopardizing that relationship. And then in this broader context of geopolitical competition with Russia and China, there's even more of an argument that we can't piss off the Saudis. Or anyone else for that matter, which really
hence the fist bump, hence the MBS fist bump by the Biden administration.
Exactly. In the wake of Biden making all of these commitments, both on the campaign trail and then once he was president, as you said, saying that he was going to end U.S. involvement, or he wanted to end the war in Yemen, and specifically end U.S. support for offensive actions. However, under the Biden administration, we actually saw Saudi airstrikes go up from what they had been under Trump, which is shocking because Trump was giving all kinds of support to the Saudis, as people will probably remember the extent of the closeness between the Trump administration, specifically Kushner, and Mohammed bin Salman. So then the fact that airstrikes went up under Biden was truly just completely went against his own statements about the fact that he was going to end U.S. support for offensive actions.